Okay, so this is Sarah and Cindy again, and we want to say thank you to Leanne for her beautiful stories that she's shared with us. I think it's important for me. I always find that stories really resonate with me long after I've heard them, and sometimes I have to hear them several times. So Leanne's video leaks, you have a link there, it's on her website, and I enjoy watching it over and over again, so you might want to return to it another time. So we see this really as the start of a conversation we hope that we continue to have, and we hope you will continue to have in your own communities, homes, and families. We want to pose back, I guess, some questions that you can carry with you into your own work and thinking about these issues. So first, for Indigenous people, we think it's important to ask if there are stories in your own community or family, your own cultural teachings that could help to similarly reframe how we think about family and think about violence within our own teachings. For non-Indigenous anti-violence practitioners, thinking about how your own organization or practice can foster spaces in which Indigenous knowledge can be centered. How do we make space for that? And for funders and policymakers, how can this story help to foster this reimagining of how family violence and health are really defined, especially reorienting toward Indigenous concepts and, again, allowing space for that? So these are just some questions. There's many more that you can ask, but to continue to talk about in your own networks. And we have some readings here that we encourage you to look at if you want to pull up. Some of them we've mentioned. So Leanne's piece, Dancing on Our Turtle's Back. There's also, which is a book, Beautiful Stories as well. The book we mentioned before with some of the people from the National Collaborating Center on Determinants of Health, Thinking Beyond the Social. An article that we referenced there by Cindy Baskin as well from 2006. And then we have a link to a piece on Leanne's blog, some resources from the Native East Sexual Health Network, who do really amazing work with youth. And then a talk that I did around thinking about recentering our relationships as legal kind of agreements about how we treat one another and addressing violence through those. So those are some of the readings that we would suggest. There's many more, but that's a starting place. So we now have time for questions. We will start by asking Leanne some questions. Leanne, you're still there?
I am.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for all that you've shared so far. We really appreciate, as you know, having you in this dialogue today. I'm curious, I guess, thinking about these kind of teachings about consent from your own stories and own cultural knowledge. You shared kind of one way of responding to within your own family, kind of the way that violence ruptures consensual relations. How do you see, I guess, either in your own life or in your communities, ways that we can foster these relations of consent in everyday life?
Well, I think in my family and hanging out a lot with my sisters and their children, our kids, this next generation, seems to be very literate around consent, around their body, consent about what their body does. And I think that that's a really, really beautiful resurgence of Anishinaabe teachings. Children and parenting looked a little different within Anishinaabe practices. Children are seen as gifts from the spiritual world. They're closer to the spiritual world because they've just come from the spiritual world. And so the idea that children have lots to share and have lots to teach and have lots to give to adults is a really important part of parenting and developing really great relationships with children. And so I think that that's really where I see a lot of this starting, is in fostering nonviolent relationships that are based upon consent and based upon naming feelings, naming violences, and figuring out how to problem solve in daily life in a way that's respectful and that takes into account different perspectives. So sort of generating solutions to problems collaboratively. I think that's been a really powerful process in my family. So I think one of the things that's beautiful about a lot of Indigenous thought is that those same teachings that we use to kind of govern our nations and our communities are also the practices that we use to make decisions and to develop those intimate relationships in families and as an individual. So I think that that's one area where we have some power and influence, where we can start to set up these alternative mechanisms.
Thank you. So we're just looking at some of the questions that people are sending in. One of them has to do with working, I guess, cross-culturally, say doing work as an Anishinaabe person with Dene communities. Similarly, I'm Kwagilth and do work with various other communities. How do we translate these teachings cross-culturally?
Well, I think for me, when I travel to Dene territory, I carry with me Anishinaabe ethics and practices that instruct me on how I behave and how I operate when I'm in that territory. And so one of the things that we do is we introduce ourselves. In Mississauga traditions, we would say our clan first, where we're coming from, where we stayed last night, and then our name. And then the next thing that we would do is acknowledge whose territory that we're in, not in sort of a superficial way, but as a way of indicating that we are not there, that we come in peace, that we come with respect for this case, Dene sovereignty and self-determination over their territory, and that as a guest in those territories that we're going to conduct ourselves in a way that is in line with their ethics and values and governance and politics. And so it's been a very, very rich experience for me to develop relationships with Dene people as an Anishinaabe person. And I think I've learned a lot about what it means to be Anishinaabe, and also sort of the similarities and differences in our perspectives coming from an urbanized southern community and working in the north. So I think that that's been a very rich experience for me, and I think it's an opportunity to make sure that I know what those practices are of international travel.
Great, thank you.
So there have been some questions also posed about how do we apply some of these teachings and stories and concepts in our workplaces, or also in working with healthcare providers to create culturally safe healthcare. And so I'm wondering if you have any thoughts that you could share around that, Leanne.
I think for me, I think that's the big question, and I think it's a question that requires a collaborative answer, and it requires, I think, some critical thought about the institutions and the workplaces that we're working in, and about the ability of institutions to change. I think institutions, in my experience, tend to change very, very slowly, and I think that can be very difficult for Indigenous people, both inside and outside those institutions. So I think these conversations sort of need to take place collaboratively with Indigenous peoples, with groups of like-minded people, and I think they can't just be conversations. I think one of the most powerful lessons that you get from groups like the Native Youth Sexual Health Network is that they're organizing on the ground outside of institutions, often outside of funding models, and they're just doing the work anyway. And as they do the work anyway, they get better at it, and they get more skilled, and they do different kinds of work, and sort of engaged in those community processes, they change, and change starts to happen. So I think there is not a cookie cutter approach to this, but I think for me on an individual level, I think that when I'm working in an institution, I'm thinking about those basic values and ethics of consent, of respect, of gentleness, of compassion, of empathy, of understanding, of having this responsibility to educate myself about the history and the realities, the presence of the Indigenous territory that I'm in. I think I've had really amazing experiences in the healthcare system around Indigenous midwifery. That's been a site where I think that community has really been able to center their practice of healthcare and wellness and birth around indigeneity. I've had mostly horrible experiences interacting with hospitals and doctors. Not all the time, but I think in a lot of ways, just those basic values would have gone a long way to making my family's experience having to go into these healthcare situations. It would have made them a lot better.
Right. I think this is exactly how we want to think about bringing the core values of the stories and poems that you're sharing with us. It is about those grounded concepts and applying them in our everyday lives, in our workplaces, in the work we're doing, and in our relationships with one another outside of our workplaces as well. Sarah's going to mention another question that's coming in.
Yeah, so there's a question someone's asking about how we can address some of the violence that we see, what's been called now lateral violence, or violence that happens in, whether it's in the workplace or just in various places in Indigenous communities, that we ourselves are a part of those networks. How do we work together? We're kind of talking about kind of within different systems and things, but in those more maybe community spaces, how do we begin to make changes, especially when we all have, or many people have various forms of violence that they've experienced. So how do we make those small shifts in how we're breaking, I guess, the patterns that have been learned?
That's a good question, and it's also a really, really hard question to answer. I guess I see in my experience, in my own life and in my own family and in the communities that I travel in, is I see a lot of hurt in Indigenous people. I see a lot of hurt in myself, and I think that that's sometimes the root of things like lateral violence, and that's the root of why we replicate this sort of horrible violence in intimate spaces that has been really heaped on us through colonialism. And so I guess for myself, I try to be responsible about that in my own life and to not engage in lateral violence. I try to take good care of myself, and I try to have some critical self-awareness around the issues, my own issues, and my own triggers and the way that I'm conducting myself. And so I find that I'm less susceptible to getting hurt from lateral violence when I'm grounded, when I've done ceremony, when I've spent time on the land, when I've, done all those regular wellness things that I certainly don't have time for. I think as communities, it's important that we talk about this and that we name it and that we come up with spaces in our workplaces, in our organizations. We're having these kinds of discussions, and we're coming up with collaborative, community-based alternatives or mechanisms to address this. And I think it's important that those are collaborative and, again, aren't cookie-cutter solutions to this. But I think that this is a question that every time I talk about violence, particularly amongst Indigenous women and the queer community, lateral violence comes up. And it seems like there's a lot of things that Indigenous people don't have influence over. But this is one thing that I think that we can, working together, thinking critically, being very gentle and compassionate, but also naming it, can come up with alternative mechanisms for dealing with it other than what we have right now, which is either sweeping it under the rug and ignoring it, or engaging in, there's very few kind of workplace policies around this, or engaging in those kind of policies and not having the kind of outcomes that we're looking for.
Okay, thank you. There was a question as well, kind of drawing on all of what we've been talking about, just that there are various ways we continue to hear stories about different kinds of harms that our community individuals are experiencing. So the example was around suicide, high rates of suicides in communities. And, we've just seen another story about a community with a rash of suicides since December, and that those young people were in state care or had some form of engagement with the systems. And the question was kind of about, while there's such anger at, these instances that keep happening and seeing those systemic factors, how does that kind of balance out with the desire to use these more strength-based approaches? And the person was asking about if, this kind of concept of reconciliation that's being talked about, how do those kind of mesh when we're seeing constantly the really violent impacts of state systems and wanting to move towards these different kind of approaches?
I think it's hard for me to talk about reconciliation when you see the apprehension of our children and the economy of it and the violence of that and the scale of that. so huge. And in many reports, there are more kids in care right now than there were at the height of the residential school system. So this is an ongoing violence that our communities, that the most vulnerable people in our communities are facing. There's been a tremendous amount of activism around this, in the last several decades, and we've yet to see significant change. And so I think that there are some really strong and beautiful advocates for our children, but this is something that makes it very difficult to believe that Canada as a state and as a society is really, truly interested in reconciliation when you have on one hand an apology from Harper and you have on the other hand the violence is being replicated in an intense way against our children. And so it's a horrible, horrible reality that we're facing, and that there needs to be long-term structural changes. There needs to be changes immediately in the short term. And I think that there's a lot of things that communities are doing outside of government funding and outside of institutions to ensure that our children feel loved and supported and cared for, and that their emotional, spiritual, cultural, physical needs are being met. And I see sort of Indigenous adults and parents working very hard with very few resources and very, very little support in urban areas and reserved communities. But I think that work is vital. And I think that that question is just brilliant, and it hits sort of the nail on the head of the hypocrisy of what's going on right now in terms of violence in Canada. So I don't have an answer except to say thank you for that question. And that's something that I think a lot more critical thought and action has to be pushed, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for the question and thank you for the response, because as we're talking about not having cookie cutter approaches and not a one size fits all and many things happening, and it is important to also remember and center what is happening, what Indigenous communities are doing to support children. There's a question that's been asked, Leanne, about the value of non-interference, and wondering if you could say a bit more about that and how it applies to being an agent of social institutional change. How does it play out? What does that look like?
I think in Anishinaabe society, we have a strong ethic of non-interference. So it's an idea that was used in our practices to promote diversity. So although there were maybe responsibilities that different genders often did, I am a woman and I really like hunting. And so that's fine within the variance of what my responsibilities are as a human being because of this ethic of non-interference. So I'm free to do or to interpret my clan responsibilities. I'm free to interpret my name's responsibilities. I'm free to interpret my gender and how I want to express that gender, my sexual orientation and how I want to express that sexual orientation. And so I think inside these intimate Indigenous spaces, that high level of respect and for individual self-determination within a context of shared ethics and values. I come from one of the so-called hunting and gathering societies. We were living in very close quarters in the winter. And ethics of non-interference was a way of respecting each other's mind, body, and spirit, and how we might interpret that, and how the diversity of ways you can live as a good contributing Anishinaabe person in the world. I think colonialism provides a certain challenge then for that kind of ethic. And I think that I'm someone who thinks it's really important to dismantle the system of settler colonialism and things like heteropatriarchy. And so that requires interference, that requires intervention, that requires speaking back to, that requires critical thought. But I see those things, my voice, my experience, the protection of my own body and mind and spirit and those of my family as Anishinaabe values as well. And so I advocate for the for Indigenous people interfering with colonialism and settler colonialism. But in the context of our families and those intimate spaces, I think that I try to practice those teachings of diversity and respect and non-interference.
Thanks, Leanne.
One of the questions we talked about unceded territories or lands being unceded, and just for clarification about what that means, I think that's important to talk about because it kind of underlies our conversations or is understood differently. Do you mind talking a bit about that?
Well, I think oftentimes the word unceded is used in places where Indigenous nations have not signed treaties with the state. And so you'll hear it a lot in British Columbia. You'll also hear it in parts of Ontario and across Canada. I feel like my ancestors signed treaties, a number of different treaties with different European powers and then Canada. But I don't think that our intention was to cede land. It wasn't a financial transaction. We weren't handing over our land. I think from within our own political traditions, we were allowing settlers to come into our territory and have a space to live the way that they wanted to, but we expected that our way of living and that our political system and that our nation and way of governing would also be respected. To me, it's a term that, in a sense, all of Indigenous lands are unceded. There's only a few cases legally and more recently where people were, I guess, knew that they were giving up right to their land. I don't know if you have anything to add, maybe, Sarah?
No, I mean, I think that it's important to recognize is that each community, and especially just moving across from east to west, that there's such different histories of understanding how land and rights and peoples and the relationship to colonial processes. Here on the coast, we have such a shorter 150 years or a little bit more of that. And just the processes by which people were displaced and that was all quite different than in other places. Like we all have our unique histories of that. So I think the understanding of land being unceded in one place is different from another. That would be the only thing that I would add, I guess.
And this is Cindy. I'll just say that I really appreciated what you said, Leanne, there at the end about how we come to understand what does it mean that people think that certain land was ceded and therefore that land is no longer in question, or we don't need to think about that. As a white woman from Ontario, I know moving to British Columbia that when I went back to Ontario and spoke about being on unceded Coast Salish territories, people would say, oh, well, here it's different, as if Indigenous people were happy to give up the land. That kind of colonial thinking about can manifest. And so it's really important for white settlers to be really mindful about how we're talking about the land and about that recognition of Indigenous land theft.
We'll just wrap up with maybe one more question, Leanne. And thank you so much for this discussion. And thanks to everyone who's joined us and is listening still. Had a number of different questions, and some people have been sharing some examples of work that they're involved with, which is really powerful. Different ways of addressing violence or fostering spaces in which family and kinship systems are being centered in different ways. So it's really great to have that conversation online. I think that, one of the questions was because of the hurt, the kind of the trauma that people are experiencing, how people who've experienced that trauma and are doing anti-violence work recenter our own hurt. As you said, there's a lot of hurt in our communities. And how do we then break those patterns or create new ways of approaching the work? I don't want to answer the question for you, but I do want to say that's partly why we had you, Leanne, speak today, is because the first part we talked about the different approaches that we see, and that if we approach from really a very different cultural framework, instead of starting with the violence, to start with different teachings with different relations, that provides just a reorientation to even thinking about family and thinking about ourselves and our relationships. So I don't know if you want to add anything or answer the question, but any final thoughts on that?
Well, I think this work is very, very difficult. And I think because colonialism isn't something that Indigenous people experience in the past, because it's something that very much impacts every moment of every day still, I find my experience as an Indigenous woman is that I'm continually getting hurt. I'm continually having to heal from this violence. And so I think in order to, in my capacity as an activist or as a teacher, particularly as a teacher, I sort of constantly have students that are coming and disclosing and needing a space to talk about things, many of the violences that I've experienced in my own life. And so I think in this work, I have to plan on that, and I have to make sure that I'm taking care of myself and that I'm processing the issues that I have to process and that I'm being responsible about my own emotions and my own trauma in my life in order to be able to do that work. And at times, I think that means for me personally, I need to step back from it. And I guess a large part of why I take the approach that I've taken today is because part of not just surviving, but of living is feeling joy and feeling pride and feeling hope. And I find a lot of that in the activities that were documented in the slides and in our stories and in our songs. I try to set that as the center, those Indigenous practices as the center of my life as much as possible.
Thanks, Leanne, so much again.
Thank you for having me, Cindy and Sarah, and for your fantastic presentation. And thanks to everyone who, it's so weird, I have no idea who the audience is, but thanks for coming.
Thank you, Leanne, and thank you, everyone. Thank you to the National Collaborating Center for hosting this important conversation today, and we look forward to ruminating on the learnings as we leave. Thank you all.
Okay, on behalf of the National Collaborating Center for Aboriginal Health, I'd just like to thank everybody for joining us today. Special thanks to Leanne and Cindy and Sarah for sharing their knowledge and their stories with us today. It's greatly appreciated. Just a reminder that a recording of this webinar will be available on our website in the coming weeks. And please let us know how we did today by filling out the webinar evaluation. It will be sent to your email. So thanks, everyone.